Just then, Gong Yixiao had also thought of grabbing a random disciple and using them as a weight, but it was only a fleeting idea. Since Shen Qingqiu went ahead and did it on his own, Gong Yixiao breathed a sigh of relief for not having to knock out someone from his own sect. The two of them walked out together. Seeing Shen Qingqiu gather the black robe closer around himself again, Gong Yixiao felt as if there was a lump in his throat. Gong Yixiao couldn't help but feel sorry for him. Though Shen Qingqiu was a peak lord, there was nothing he could do about being imprisoned and disgraced. Not only that, he could only cover himself up with the clothing of the same person who humiliated him. It really made people sigh with regret and pity. Shen Qingqiu saw that Gong Yixiao's eyes seemed to flicker with sympathy and something like grief and indignation. He could only react by remaining expressionless. Suddenly, Gong Yixiao said, "Elder, please take it off." Shen Qingqiu... ... What? Without waiting for him to recover, Gong Yixiao already started to take off his own outer robe. Shen Qingqiu was considering whether or not he should throw a critical hit at him to wake him up, but Gong Yixiao had already taken off his outer robe and presented it to him with both hands. He said, "Please wear this one." Shen Qingqiu suddenly saw the light. Oh, so this is what he meant. Even though Luo Binghe's clothes were black, the clothing was similar to the person. It had the same low-key extravagant connotation that the protagonist himself did, and all in all, it was still very conspicuous if he wore it. If he changed into a common white robe, it would be quite beneficial to his escape, right? Gong Yixiao was too thoughtful. Shen Qingqiu resolutely removed Luo Binghe's robe and changed into Gong Yixiao's. Before leaving, he thought for a moment, then took the time to fold Luo Binghe's robe. Only after this did he place it on the ground. Navigation wasn't particularly difficult upon first leaving the water prison, but the further they walked, the more Shen Qingqiu came to appreciate that Huanghua Palace's maze array was indeed exceptionally terrifying. They travelled through cave after cave, path intersecting with path, and every couple of steps they'd circle round and around to the point it made his head spin. Despite walking so close to Gong Yixiao's back, Shen Qingqiu almost lost him quite a few times. If Gong Yixiao hadn't known the assignments and schedules of the water prison staff like the back of his hand, who knew how many disciple guard patrols they would have run into? After an hour, they finally made it out of the underground water prison. They walked many kilometers more without stopping and entered Bailu Forest until they were about to cross the border of Huanghua Palace's territory. The water prison's alarm had yet to sound, meaning that no one had yet discovered that the prisoner was gone. Luo Binghe's order forbidding all others from visiting the water prison had inadvertently greatly aided Shen Qingqiu's escape. After a short rest, Shen Qingqiu said, "Young Master Gongyi, after this point, you needn't stay to send me off. Hurry back now while we're still undetected." After a pause, he added, "Within 7 days, go to Huayue City. You'll definitely find me there." "Ah, if that's the case, I won't accompany you any further," Gong Yixiao said. "Even though I don't know what Senior intends to do about these future concerns, please be careful. And Senior, please don't worry about the sect's trial next month. It's as you said, those clean will remain clean no matter what. The sect leaders will obviously exonerate you." Unable to help himself, Shen Qingqiu laughed. First, his dark history was set in stone and couldn't be erased. Second, the trial next month had fuck all to do with him. He immediately cupped his hands, carefree and satisfied. "May we meet again," he said. The road from Huanghua Palace's border to Huayue City ran through the most densely populated and economically developed stretch of the Central Plains. This also meant that an especially large number of secular cultivation sects and influential families were located within the area. The cultivators of this world highly valued aerial defense. Like in Jinglan City, They often set up aerial defense barriers over their territories. If an immortal sword or spiritual artifact flew through it above the speed limit, it would undoubtedly be discovered and reported to the sect's higher-ups. Obviously, traveling in this way would be like bombastically broadcasting his escape trajectory via a megaphone. Shen Qingqiu flew part of the way and walked another without rest until he finally arrived at Huayue City the following night. His arrival timing was terribly unfortunate, as a festival celebrating the establishment of Huayue City was in full swing. The city was adorned with colored lanterns and would brightly lit the entire night. Soaring dragons and lion dancers filled the streets, the drums and music thunderous. People were packed together, vendors next to vendor, peddlers shouldering their poles as they slunk down every street. Practically everyone had poured out of their homes. Even more unfortunate was that, on his arrival, dark clouds covered the moon. Without the support of sun or moonlight, the chance his plan would fail greatly increased. Anxious about the odds, Shen Qingqiu decided to wait for the time being. At most 1 day. If after that day the clouds had yet to disperse, he couldn't afford to care anymore. If the chance of failure remained greater, so be it. A risk would still be better than clinging to an overripe sun moon dew flower and crying about it. At that point, even if it was cooked and served with alcohol, it would just reek of fertilizer. As Shen Qingqiu walked cautiously, he occasionally bumped into the rowdy children or brushed past groups of laughing girls, and he felt very slightly that it really was a pity. If he weren't currently fleeing for his life, he would have liked to take a thorough tour of the city. Suddenly, several men, all dressed in clothes of the same color, were walking toward him, long swords slung over their backs. Each one held his head high and chest out. From a glance, one could tell they were arrogant disciples from a random sect. Though it sounded strange, the smaller and more random the sect, the more afraid their disciples would be that others didn't know that they were cultivators. If they could have gotten away with it, they would have emblazoned their clothes with huge slogans. Shen Qingqiu turned his body in a natural manner and smoothly picked up a demon mask from the side. He placed it over his face, then openly and confidently walked towards them. At the festival, 6 out of 10 attendees were wearing masks. If he mixed in with them, he didn't have to fear drawing attention. "Marshal brother, would that Shoya sword really sit around in the city, waiting to be captured?" one man from the group asked. "Ah, the 4 sects sent out the warrant for his capture as one. How could it be fake?" The leader berated him. "Didn't you see how many sects have sent people here to box him in? Keep an eye out. You saw Huanghua Palace's bounty too. Don't you want it?" Myriads of thoughts filled Shen Qingqiu's mind. It turned out that, without his knowledge, he's become a wanted criminal. It's no wonder Huanghua Palace put down such a large sum. What happened to them was really just awful. Oi. The most I did to them was knock out an insignificant disciple, Shen Qingqiu thought. I didn't do anything else, so how did Huanghua Palace suddenly become the tragic victim? He wanted to keep listening, but they pulled further and further ahead, and the rush of people cut him off, so he could only give up. While he was mulling over whether he should find an abandoned residence to rest, he felt a sudden weight upon his leg. When he looked down, he saw a small child clinging to his thigh. That child unhurriedly raised his head. His face was pallid, like he was malnourished, but his eyes were both large and bright. They stared straight at Shen Qingqiu as the boy clung to his thigh, unwilling to let go. Shen Qingqiu patted his head. Who's your family? Did you get lost? The small child nodded, and when he spoke, his voice was meek and sweet. I got lost. The child's appearance were naturally endearing, and it even seemed a little familiar, so Shen Qingqiu leaned over to pick him up, letting him sit on his arm. Who did you come here with? The child clung to his neck and pursed his lips. With Shizun. Was he some sect's young disciple? Then if a grown-up came to look for him, Shen Qingqiu was in for a real headache. But for some reason, the forlorn way the boy said Shizun stirred Shen Qingqiu's pity down to the core. He just couldn't harden his heart and toss the child to the side of the road, leaving him to continue huddling miserably. He patted the boy's soft little behind. Your Shizun didn't look after you properly. How incredibly awful of him. Where did you get lost? Do you remember? The child giggled into his ear. I remember. Shizun personally threw me down himself, so how could I not? Half of Shen Qingqiu's body went utterly cold. It was as if he held in his arms wasn't the body of a young child, but a poisonous snake, a massive snake that had coiled around his neck and bared his fangs, poised to bite and inject venom into him at any moment. He abruptly threw aside the person in his arms and turned around, his back covered in goosebumps. The fine hairs all over his body promptly stood straight up. The entire street was looking at him, the ones wearing masks, the ones not wearing masks. It was like they were suddenly all immobilized, holding their breaths and watching him. The ones wearing masks were frightening with their sinister and demonic visages, but the ones not wearing masks were even more panic-inducing. They didn't have faces! Shen Qingqiu's instinct in that second was to place his hand on Xiuya's sword, but he shortly caught himself. He couldn't attack. This was what he'd once taught Luo Binghe, while within Menmo's barrier. To attack the people who appeared in the dream realm was to in fact attack your own self. Cold sweat dripped from Shen Qingqiu's forehead. He had wholly, completely failed to realize that he'd entered this barrier. To be fair, people never remembered when and how exactly one of these dreams began. But he'd been fleeing. Surely he hadn't been so dull-witted as to fall asleep on the side of the road while running for his life. From behind him, there came a tender voice. Shizun. Moments ago, when this voice had been by his ear, it had sounded clearly and utterly adorable and innocent. But when he listened to it now, it actually possessed some unspeakably terrifying quality. Why don't you want me anymore? The child form of Luo Binghe asked faintly from where he stood behind Shen Qingqiu. Shen Qingqiu decisively refused to turn his head and immediately took off. Though he said that all these faceless people were watching him, no, he couldn't call it watching because they didn't even have eyes. But their faces still turned in Shen Qingqiu's direction, and he could indeed feel the weight of countless gazes upon him. Shen Qingqiu pretended he couldn't see any of this and charged straight ahead, thrusting aside anyone in his way. Suddenly, a hand intercepted his palm. He turned his head to look. Though this hand was slim, it possessed a terrifying strength, basically like an iron shackle. A 14-year-old Luo Binghe firmly gripped his wrist. On his face was not only the bruising that had never been allowed to heal, but an overflowing melancholy. Those pitch-black eyes stared right back at him, almost within reach. You're still coming! Shen Qingqiu tried 3 times before he finally flung off Luo Binghe, then pushed aside the crowd and continued to flee. First was a child, second was a youth. If the adult version came next, he really wouldn't be able to take it. But the street seemed to go on forever, with no end in sight. After a sequence of small stalls on either side, faceless playing children and demon-masked girls appeared a second time. Shen Qingqiu was finally certain. This dream realm street was looping. Going forward was fruitless. Since neither going forward nor backward would work, he'd blaze a different trail. Shen Qingqiu looked left and right, then darted up to a liquor shop. Crimson lanterns hung high over the shop's doors, the red glow muted and beautiful, yet the wooden doors were tightly shut. Shen Qingqiu pulled open the doors and had just walked inside when they slammed shut by themselves. The interior of the house was dark, and a cold breeze blew through it. Rather than being the inside of a liquor shop, it felt more like he'd entered a cave. Shen Qingqiu didn't think this was unexpected. Dream realms couldn't be understood using common sense. Every door had the potential to lead anywhere. At this moment, a series of eerie noises drifted into his ear. They sounded like the intensely labored, incessant panting of a person close to death, whose lungs had been punctured, who was in terrible agony. Moreover, it didn't sound like only one person. Shen Qingqiu snapped his fingers, flicking a flame forth from his fingertips, and aimed it towards the origin of those strange noises. The flame illuminated the scene in its entirety, leaving out not a single detail. His pupils instantly shrank to pinpoints. Liu Qingge held Chen Luan's sword, the blade aimed at himself, and was stabbing it into his own chest.